When Bill Clinton was reelected in 1996, that made him the first Democratic president since Franklin Roosevelt to be reelected to a second term. That said, Republicans do not have that great a presidential track record either. Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush were the only Republican presidents to serve 2 terms since Ike. Richard Nixon was a Republican, and he did get elected twice, but Nixon, of course, had to quit during his second term because he was a crook. Richard Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, also turned out to be a crook. So when he had to resign, even before Nixon did, Nixon appointed a new vice president named Gerald Ford. That was an appointment, not an election. So when Nixon then had to quit, too, this man who was never elected president and who was never elected vice president, a man who had been appointed to that position and then only got to the Oval Office because the 2 crooks ahead of him in line got caught and had to quit, Gerald Ford inexplicably became president of the United States. And then less than 1 month after taking office in that rather gangster sort of way, Gerald Ford said that Richard Nixon, according to him, was off the hook, scot-free.
I deeply believe in equal justice for all Americans, whatever their station or former station. The law, whether human or divine, is no respecter of persons, but the law is a respecter of reality. Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, do grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in.
And so Richard Nixon had to quit the presidency, but he never otherwise had to pay for what he did. The nation turfed the guy who pardoned Nixon out of office the first chance they had to vote on him in 1976. But over time, Gerald Ford's decision to retroactively excuse everything Nixon did for the sake of the nation and moving on and not looking back, that became a lauded decision, a patriotic move, for the reasons that Ford argued when he let Nixon off the hook, that the country would be better off not dealing with this anymore, that we needed our long national nightmare of finding out what a crook our president was to be over. In his new book, constitutional lawyer and principled provocateur Glenn Greenwald argues that the American public was right the first time when we reacted to the pardoning of Richard Nixon with revulsion and anger. That the precedent of that pardon, of important people getting away with crimes because it is disruptive and upsetting to our institutions if they don't get away with it, Glenn argues that that precedent set us up for 4 straight decades lousy with important people being allowed to commit crimes simply because they are important people. And that has led us to this moment, where in America that has long been divided between rich and poor, where the 1% have long outpaced the rest of the country economically, that has led to a country where the 99% are starting to look at that 1% and starting to look at the political elites, not just as lucky, not just as elite, but as beneficiaries of a system that is not fair, and that hasn't been fair for a long time now. Joining us now is my friend Glenn Greenwald. He is a contributing writer at Salon, and his latest book, With Liberty and Justice for Some, is out today. And I can tell you I liked it so much I blurbed it on the back. And I don't go around blurbing willy-nilly. Glenn, congratulations on this.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
What is you highlight the pardon of Nixon as an important sort of political inflection point in modern American politics. What of that rationale do you still see surviving in American politics?
Look at the last decade of when you see enormous numbers of crimes being committed, egregious crimes by the most powerful people in the society, the creation of a worldwide torture regime, spying on American citizens without the warrants required by criminal law, an aggressive attack on Iraq, various aspects of obstruction of justice, the destruction of evidence that courts and the 9/11 Commission have ordered to be preserved. And then in the private sector, you see massive fraud precipitating the financial crisis, mortgage fraud on a systematic level, telecoms participating in illegal spying. None of those. They are not bad policy decisions. They're not immoral acts. Those are crimes. None of them have led to meaningful criminal investigations, let alone criminal prosecutions or accountability. And the reason is because we now are a country that explicitly argues that political elites and financial elites, now private sector elites, should be immunized from the rule of law because of all the things that you just pointed out were argued by Gerald Ford to justify the pardon of Richard Nixon. It created this precedent and this mindset that has now seeped into the private sector as well, that the rule of law is only for what Occupy Wall Street calls the 99%.
And that is an important, that last transition point, that it became not just an unpleasantness to be avoided, but it became an active political good to insulate elites from accountability for the good of the institutions that they represent, for the good of the nation's stability. That justified all of the pardons of the Reagan administration officials after Iran-Contra. It's what you say, you name a chapter too big to jail, as opposed to too big to fail, coming off of our discussion with Eric Schneiderman, New York's Attorney General, who does not believe in too big to jail. How did it become an active political good to excuse wrongdoing rather than just a bad to be avoided?
Well, keep in mind that there's a big split on this question between media and political elites on the one hand and ordinary Americans on the other. So as you pointed out, the pardon of Richard Nixon was something that triggered revulsion among the American population. You even listen to it now and you recoil at the idea that this criminal, this clearly, flagrantly criminal individual, Richard Nixon, was simply protected by virtue of his status at the same time that hundreds of thousands of Americans were being prosecuted for trivial offenses. And so what you see is that there's an elite class that supported that pardon and that continues to say we cannot have investigations of the Bush torture regime. It was good that Caspar Weinberger was pardoned because he is a good man who doesn't belong in prison. And so you see this elite class whose interest it is to maintain this elite immunity constantly arguing for it. Whereas if you look at polls, it's not just the pardon of Richard Nixon that triggers revulsion. At the beginning of the Obama presidency, large percentages of Americans, majorities, wanted investigations into whether the Bush torture scheme, whether the eavesdropping program, whether the obstruction of justice were criminal and illegal, because inculcated in the American mind is the idea that we are all equal before the law. And it's because we're not that you see such citizen anger and the loss of faith in the legitimacy of political institutions.
And the reason that we have faith in those institutions is not just because they are institutions and they are stable, but because we want to believe they are just. And that is I think a trenchant point and a confrontational one, and I think you make it beautifully, Glenn. So thank you for writing this book. I think it's a really big deal, and I think it's really important.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. I appreciate it.
Glenn's new book is called With Liberty and Justice for Some, How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality and Protect the Powerful. And it's really, really good. Recommended. All right. Giant scary nukes. Neutered. A moment of geek. Straight ahead.